Well, thank you everyone for coming here tonight to our Poets Year In. It's a little bit different than in previous years, but we wanted to celebrate poetry in some way. So we've asked some of the poets, actually we asked all of the poets who submitted their poems this year to Poets Year In to come and for those who wanted to read their poems. So we appreciate them very much. There's some really fantastic ones. And for all the other ones, if you go to our website at TADL.org, right on the main page is a flip book of the poets, and you can read each poem. They're really fantastic. I suggest everyone check it out. All of our events from the library is at TADL.org/events, and this program, as well as most of our programs, are also recorded and put on our YouTube channel, which is TADL Not Just Books. And tonight we are having Teresa Scollon host for us. She'll introduce each of the poets and we'll have a short discussion afterwards. So Teresa is a local poet. She's also an essayist, an editor, an educator, as well as a huge library supporter, which is how I met her. She, on her website at teresascollon.com, she can tell me if that's wrong. She has a blog, which I found very interesting and funny. There is one section on finding and reading contemporary poetry where she says that libraries could recommend a lot of poetry to people, but a lot of them confess that they don't actually read poetry, which is, I find to be very true. I usually will recommend all of our local poets because those are the ones that are so close to me that I know, like Teresa Scollon, Fleda Brown, Michael Delp, Lois Beardsley, just to name a few. She's right. Poetry is definitely something I think that's learned, but also can come from within. Also on her website, with her poem Catechism, Fleda Brown mentioned or did a review, and she said with Teresa's poems, she says there's no poetizing, there's no sloppiness, nothing that isn't true, and nothing that isn't a poem, which I thought was a great description of Teresa's poetry. So I appreciate you coming tonight, Teresa, and introducing the poets. For everyone else watching too, I forgot to mention at the end, you can put in the chat if you have any questions or comments at all, and we'll discuss those and use them at the end of the conversation. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, Betsy. That was very kind. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here to listen to some poems. I'm only going to say a few things and then introduce the poets, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards using the chat and the people you see on the screen. So we'll see what people have to say. I have found myself kind of thinking about what would I say. I don't know about you, but during this pandemic, I have found myself in periods of wordlessness. You know, I've kind of lost access to words. Many writers aren't really writing. It's kind of a fallow time. We're observing, we're reading, we're quiet, but not everybody is writing very much. And so it'll be interesting to me to see what happens after the pandemic and see what comes forth, right? If you think of it as in terms of a plant. But I also am very inspired by these kinds of gatherings where people are still gathering and finding ways to inspire each other and connect virtually when we can't gather in person. So there's something about our impulse to gather and make art together that continues to be really affirming and nourishing in all kinds of ways. So I'm glad to be here tonight. I would just say, Betsy asked me to say a little bit about poetry. And I think for me, two ideas consistently come up in my mind. And one is that when I was in high school, a teacher told me that everything is connected and the job of the poet is to make those connections visible. So I think poems do that. There's sometimes these unpredictable leaps in a poem. That's the poet trying to chart a connection between two things that people might not think of as connected. And that's often quite a beautiful surprise in a poem, to see things connected. The other idea that I think about a lot is the idea of holding something in the light. And especially during times when there's a lot of hard difficult news. You know, a poem can hold something quite beautiful into the light, or something ordinary that when you look at it a certain way, we can appreciate its beauty. So those two things are what I'm listening for in poems. And I think I'll leave it there and introduce people. So we'll start with Peter Bergen. Peter is a professional musician, a budding writer, and he's going to read a poem called Lester.
Thank you, Teresa, for those great words. As Teresa mentioned, I'm a professional musician, so the last year has been fairly quiet for me. And one of the, despite all the difficulties with that, one of the benefits has been that it's finally given me some space to come back to writing from a long time ago. I wrote as a kid, and then that kind of fell to the wayside. And I've always wanted to write and wanted to get back to it. As a musician, everything, my mind was just so full of music, there was no space for anything else. And so now there is. So I've tried my hand at some poetry here, and I wrote a poem here based on recollections of living near a lake when my kids were younger. And so that's what this poem called Lester is about. 3 parallel planks, rigid above gray waters, furrowed and scarred by cruel ice and heat, softened by falling fresh feet, caretaker of confessions cast, true at last. Its owner was a man with 91 birthdays, whose smile had the power to render them invisible. Nothing I like more than watching a boy fish, was all the young ones needed to hear. Their father knew well of summer's imprint upon young minds, yet less about its reality, casting a line, setting a hook, gutting a fish on an altar for anglers. Still, this father knew enough to heed the narrow lane and tall oaks leading to Lester's smile. Knew enough to let children do as they do with an old man's dock. Day transfigures into dusk, blush bleeding to celeste, into azure, now into ebony, an unrehearsed duet with silence so deep it presses upon face and ear. I wink at my daughter, finger across beaming smile. We know this music. We nod and understand. The silent symphony soars from soil to star. So thank you for the chance to read. I really enjoyed being here, and look forward to hearing a lot more poetry tonight.
Thank you for that, Peter. In my classroom, we've evolved this method of praise, visual praise. Thank you very much for that. So next, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Krulikowski. She is a poetry activist. She is the president of 2 groups, the Poetry Society of Michigan and the Friends of Poetry of Kalamazoo. And tonight she's going to read a poem entitled Limited Perspective. Whoops, I think, there you go.
Okay. I spent the pandemic looking out my windows into my yard, which is full of deer. And I thought about the differences between how animals perceive the pandemic time and how we do. Limited perspective. Budding trees that redden the horizon don't know. The angry squirrel with the runaway baby in her mouth, bringing it roughly home, doesn't. The wind forcing limbs to lift and pitch. The wind itself, fresh from southern destruction, blows on. Fall's leaves just budged from the storm grates unaware. Grass next door turning green without its yard crew. Deer roam in herds with no leaf blowers to check them. They know something is different, but they can't nose it out. Worms rise to the garden's surface on the backs of rocks who have been through everything before. Hold it in your hand, this Petoskey stone, remnant of a coral reef. It has not given up all its secrets, grit of eternity. Lick it, rub it in your eyes.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth. More praise. Okay. Next is Ed Lindquist. And Ed is a retired registered nurse, a retired scuba instructor, and mastering the unmute button on his device. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you. It's nice to be here this evening. Yeah, I wish I could say I'm in the league with the rest of you, but yeah, this just happened to come in my head one day when I was in my scuba shop, and it happened to be my birthday. And so let's take it from there. I just call this one Happy Birthday to Me. I have this big zit on the side of my nose, which seems kind of funny because I'm 68 years old. Some things change, some things don't. Others sure will, but then there's those that won't. Me, I think I've stayed pretty much the same. But one thing's for certain, I have fewer days to remain. Oh, hey, but that's okay. I feel like a kid and it shows because I have this big zit on the side of my nose.
Thank you, Ed. It's always good to have a good laugh at a poetry reading. Next is Shirley Murray. Shirley is a retired educator, a big reader, big library supporter, and is going to be reading an aptly named poem called In Praise of the Book. Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you, Teresa and Betsy and Elizabeth, Peter, and Ed for joining me this evening. For a long time, I used to tell Teresa, I'm not a real poet. And that's because even though I was an English major in college, I never had a double major and never took a poetry course. And I didn't really like a lot of poetry, you know, where the poet has the little finger sticking up in the air with the teacup. And I just didn't think, but I did do a lot of writing, teaching and writing prose. And because of Teresa, who told me that I was a poet, I started writing more poetry. And I'm very happy. My husband and I moved to Cordia in Building 50 in Traverse City last July. And we have a wonderful writing group. In fact, I think our teacher is in Teresa's poetry group. So she follows along a lot with what Teresa has taught me. And this poem was an assignment last fall to write about an object. And the object I chose to write about was the book. And it's short and not as nearly as prosaic as the rest of you, but I'm not apologizing anymore anyway. In praise of the book, finally, I am here for you. Crumbs cleaned up, dishwasher loaded, laundry done. Lying on the floor where you fell off the bed last night. Abandoned and forsaken now, you call to me, bookmark in place. ready to be your best self while I laugh and cry and disrupt my life while I'm lost in yours.
Lovely, thank you. So even this brief reading, there's such a range of voices and music. I didn't mention music at the beginning, but that idea of the sound of words and how they, you know, I like the word chewy sometimes to describe the sound of poems. There's such a range of voices. It's really lovely to have 4 souls come into the room this way. We can open up this discussion to any old thing. Participants, I believe you're able to participate by joining the chat. Is that right, Betsy? So we could talk about each poem and what inspired each poem. We could talk about what you like, what poem you remember. That's often a good place to start. Should we start there? What poem? You go ahead, Betsy.
Thanks. What I like most, and I'm not big into poetry. My background on poetry is from is Shel Silverstein, Where the Sidewalk Ends, you know, things like that. That's what I remember most as a child. And I never really took it further other than what we had to do like in high school or early college. But what I love most about poetry, and especially the 4 of your poems, is when the actual poets read their own poems. It's so much better than you reading someone else's, you know, or me reading yours, especially out loud. I love how your inflections are, and it's different than how I might have read it, but it's so much better. So I thank you for that. That's just, it's beautiful. And of course, I'm gonna always fall in love with Shirley Murray's because it has a place in my heart about books, and it's definitely what I feel. And Ed's is just hilarious. I thought I was gonna pee my pants listening to it, but it's funny. And I love the one in Peter, yours is beautiful in such a way that I wouldn't, it's not quite how I read it. So when you read it, then I got the meaning behind it. And the same thing with Elizabeth. It's the same way. The inflection that you give in certain spots, it just makes it so much more memorable and beautiful. So thank you.
Well, if I could just comment on that, and since I'm a musician, I can relate to that. And it would be as if, imagine if we could all read the music, the notes on a page. And if I were to give you something I composed and just the notes, you might be able to make sense of that. But then if I were to play it for you, that would really bring it to life. And it's the same thing here when somebody reads their poem.
Yeah, I agree. There's for every word that goes into a poem, there's a lot that doesn't go into the poem, right? And so there's a whole life in the subtext that the author can bring to life because you know it, you know.
Well, I liked Ed's poem too. I first got interested in poetry with Billy Collins' poetry. And it was just so different from anything I ever thought of as poetry. And so I'm always looking for that little twist or bit of humor to make the poem seem fun. And Ed, your poem seemed very fun to me. But you're just a youngster. You're 60 what? 68?
68.
I'm 86.
Oh, good for you. Okay, I just wanted, this is a little bit off topic of poetry, but well, it still relates. Are people familiar with Anne Leibovitz? I think some, you know, author, comedian, however you want to put it. She has an interesting little series on Netflix with Martin Scorsese. I haven't seen all of them yet, but the second one is basically about artists, and it's how music and authors and painters and sculptors have so much to offer, and they give us such joy. It's like she says about music. You mentioned music, about how music is the only thing that can make you happy, make you smile, and it's not, drug related, which I thought was very interesting. And then her and Spike Lee get into athletes and how they should be on the same subject, he says, and she goes, no way. Anyway, so if you haven't seen that series, the second one, I really like the second one just because of the artist's aspect of it. So anyway.
We saw all 4 of those last month. And then from the library, we got her, what I can't think what the video is called now. Maybe you remember. She has a video that she does with, that's 86, no memory. But anyway, that series, it is wonderful. The whole series, don't just watch the second one. It's on YouTube too, I think.
What do you think of that idea that that the arts are a way to experience joy that's not drug related? I as a retired RN, I'm sure you have lots of opinions about that. Poetry, I think, is often described as a way of paying attention, right? A kind of a deep way of paying attention. And rather than seeking oblivion, maybe, which might be one way to describe altering your consciousness with something else. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, yeah, because it gives you such joy. I mean, you can wake up in the morning and listen to your favorite song, or open the page to the book you were reading the night before, and it just it takes you somewhere. It is an altered consciousness in a way, and I mean, yeah, it's just wonderful. Yeah.
I just read a book yesterday, which I don't read a lot of books, and it's a book about grammar. And I astonished myself, but it's called Grammar for a Full Life. And it talked about how the way you shape sentences and how you use speech really determines how you think and is reflective of how you think. So I said to a friend of mine yesterday, I said, "You're so lucky to live here." And then she said, "I'm not lucky. We planned this." And I'm like, "You're absolutely right. I should have said, you were so smart to have bought this piece of property." And there really is a difference. So I don't know, that book and its like approach to language is just fantastic.
Nice.
I'm glad for that recommendation.
Oh, it's wonderful. And it goes really quick, as long as you have your English vocabulary, because he's like, and this is positive and this and so I was thinking it's like a chemistry book for people who don't know that stuff.
What was the name of the book
The
again?
name of the book is Grammar for a Full Life.
Okay, thank you.
What has everybody been reading these days?
I've been piling back into the classics, just reading a lot of the books that I would never have dreamt reading, when I was younger. And as I read through these, some of them are harder to read, I guess, but none of them are boring, and all of them are. There's a reason why they're classics, right? And so there's always like a hidden gem, many hidden gems in these classics, and so I've been really enjoying that. And then I get to say that I've read this and that, and sound really smart too.
That's a good benefit.
Okay. The 3 books that I started, I usually read about 3 a week, but I just read for the experience. I can't tell you what I read last week or maybe even yesterday, I always remember that Billy Collins poem about first the title goes and then the, forgetting. Anyway, this is the one I started today. Who is Maud Dixon? It's a debut novel, I think. These are all from the library, Traverse Area District Library. And it's actually kind of a psychological thriller along with it, according to what I understand about it. I also love Tony Horowitz. So the one I got yesterday in large print, thank you, is the Moonflower Murders. I've read a number of his murder books. And these all happen to be thrillers. I started reading Lucy Foley. This is a brand new author for me. I've read one of her books, liked it, and so I'll stay in that field for a while. I reserve books every week, and sometimes I wait months for them, like Kristen Hanna's new book. Everybody's talking about it, who bought it. I'm still waiting. But eventually they all come, and I always have such a backup of books. And then we have a wonderful library here at Cordia as well. And I take care of that. Put the books back on the shelf and so forth.
Yeah, that Kristen Hanna book is insanely popular.
Yes, yes.
It is really good. And I like her writing, but it's also a little bit, some of it's a little hard for me. I'm a light and frivolous reader. So I like
You're a what?
A light and frivolous reader. I like anything really happy. It has to have a happy ending. And not that hers doesn't, because I think it does, but it's just, she writes about tough experiences, but Four Winds is a really good book. I've had a really, really hard time the last year sitting down and reading. So I went back to listening to audiobooks. And because I have a commute, like about a half-hour drive to Traverse every day. And so I listen to audiobooks. So I'm looking forward. I just checked out John Grisham's Sully that just came out yesterday, I think. And Belinda Castillo has a short story out. And what else? Oh, something called Finding Freedom, which sounded interesting. I do not like to read nonfiction, usually, unless it's about entertainers. And usually,
Costello.
Yes, she's fantastic. Yep.
Yes, I'm reading her series right now.
Yep.
Just finished it yesterday.
Her short stories, sadly, we don't get in print, so I always get them through ebooks or downloadable audiobooks.
Well, it's funny you say that because my middle daughter, who is a retired librarian with the Seattle Public Libraries, says that's been her feeling. She's listening to books more, and she's not going anywhere. She's retired, but right. She said it's helped her during the COVID to listen to books.
Yes.
I don't like to. I have to feel them in my hands.
I get that for sure. But listening to them, especially if you have a great narrator, is so calming and soothing. Robin Carr, who is a pretty light author, is fantastic, but her and great, wonderful women's fiction stories. But the narrator, Teresa Plummer, is fantastic. And I've listened to her. There's probably 26 or more in her series. And I've listened to those books at least probably 10 times each, just because of the narrator. She's so fantastic. Just the soothingness of it, that's what helps me to relax. But the one book that I'm excited about reading is called Finding Freedom. And it's a nonfiction book about something about a cook, and that's all I can remember. But sounds really interesting. That just came out too.
I wanted to speak up on behalf of nonfiction, because that's almost all that I read, and because I want to find out as much as I can about the world. So I wanted to talk about one other book that I thought was really good, and it's called Clean, and it's written by a doctor who just says, we all wash way too much. We're just doing damage to ourselves. And it was like, sing to me. because I hate taking showers when it's cold outside and stuff. But it's an excellent book, really good, well documented, but not boring, clean.
Well, I'm in the same boat because nonfiction is my thing too. Right now I'm reading the abridged version of the journals of Lewis and Clark. So I'm taking a lot of notes. I'm actually, so I left Petoskey yesterday and I'm in Duluth. And so I'm working my way west. I'm on my way to Washington. So part of the trip, the purpose of the trip is to follow their trail out west. And so I'm going to pick up the trail in Bismarck and then go through North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, Washington, work my way. So I'm making a lot of notes. I've got my atlas, my paper atlas that I'm making notes and so it's really fun. It is such an interesting read. I mean, the description of the countryside and the American natives and it's a wonderful read.
For anyone wanting a music related book, this is fiction, but I really highly recommend this one. It's called The Piano Shop on the Left Bank.
Yeah.
Has anybody read this?
A long time ago. Yeah.
Isn't this such a great story? The Left Bank being in Paris and just all of the passion and wonder that goes into building and maintaining pianos. It's just, you can just smell the wood and the dust in the shop when you read that book.
We had a forum yesterday with a wonderful video of a book that just came out last fall that I haven't had an opportunity yet to see if the Traverse Library has it. It's written by a Harvard professor, and he's being interviewed by a fellow, they were both Rhodes Scholars at the same time 40 years ago. And so it's very good, and I want to read the book, and it's about the danger of meritocracy. Something, it's like the treachery of meritocracy or something like that. That's not the right title, but it's like that. And the presentation was just terrific, and it inspired a wonderful discussion in the theater after we saw it yesterday. So
I'm
I do
struck
read some
by,
fiction. My husband only reads nonfiction.
yeah. I'm struck by the omnivorous character of our reading lists. So how is it that you turn to poetry to write? What is it that happens for you when you're writing a poem? What happens?
Well, I mentioned that I've come back to this, but I actually discovered poetry maybe 10 years ago as for the first time in my life. You know, I never really cared for it, or a better way of saying it, I never really appreciated what it was there in it. And it struck me at that time how like a knife, it just gets to the point, right? Just and the way you can describe things without describing it, letting the reader fill it all in, and prose does that too. But you could, since there's such an efficiency with words with poetry, you do that even more. Just putting enough out there to let the imagination go, and saying so many things with so little words. That's what really drew me to it.
Yes, I lost my hard drive, all my older writing. And so it seems easier to write poetry now that I've started doing it, but it's the same thing. It's being in the moment for me. It's the same thing when I'm reading a book. When I wrote that little tiny ditty that I read tonight, it's exactly right. When I go to that book, you know, when I have feel I have the time to read, which is every evening. I don't watch TV. It's just, I just lose myself in good literary fiction. And it has so much to say to me. And I think that that's part of the reason why I have such a large written vocabulary from reading, from my reading. Sometimes I just have to stop and write down phrases in books.
Yeah.
I love words. And my daughter's a poet too, and she's moved up here, and she's in a poetry group that meets on Tuesday nights. And I love the things that well, she's younger, you know, she's 50, but I love the things that she writes. They're just so different from anything I would write. We spent the afternoon together, and she shared a poem about different words, and she said you that are like the sports vocabulary, or you know, the different vocabularies. And like she said, today I just got one. It's called the bastard file. Now that's actually an actual kind of file. You know, file that you, the bastard file. But the whole poem is just those kinds of expressions that mean nothing to most of us, but to those in the profession or whatever,
In the know.
they're common.
Yeah. What about you, Elizabeth? What happens when you write a poem?
Well, to me, it's almost like breathing. I've been writing seriously since I was 16. So that's 54 years of practice, you know, and I just love writing because it lets me synthesize what I've experienced and learned. And I don't know where it's going until I start getting there. And I just love it when the poem kind of takes over and leads you somewhere else, you know, not where you're necessarily trying to go. I mean, it's better to not try to go anywhere. So I don't know. It is really, I mean, it's great. I love it. I try to write every day.
That makes me think of two things. Gregory Orr, the poet, has written a book called Poetry as Survival. And he is a person who went through a lot of trauma as a very young person, and is very interested in how poetry helps you reshape experience. You said synthesize, Elizabeth, and it's related, isn't it? To sort of take in your experience and then sort of recreate it so that you're understanding it at a deeper level. And go ahead.
Go ahead. No.
Yeah, the other thing I'm thinking about is Ross Gay, the poet Ross Gay, has written some really beautiful poems about gardening, etc. But says when a poem has changed your mind about something, then you know it's finished, right? There's something about that process of making it that it's active. You know, you're not downloading the poem onto the page. You're learning something, or you're seeing something in a different way, or you're altering your perspective as you write it.
You're a good explainer.
Oh, thank you.
I went to the Atlantic Center for the Arts just to study with Greg Orr for 3 weeks.
Oh, did you?
Because I felt he would be helpful to me. And he was fantastic. Very open person. If you ever get a chance to hear him, work with him, see him, he's great.
Yeah, he's amazing. What about you, Ed? What happens when you write a poem?
You know, I don't have a serious bone in my body. Anyway, I get these ideas. I've written a number for people if it's their birthday or their retirement party. I just pick out these certain scenes that I've also been with the person, and you know, they're just these little ditties, ba 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 ba, and you know, it just kind of all comes together. You know, it might be a little short one, it might be a whole page. Maybe next year I'll submit the that I did for my wife when she retired. I was already retired. Anyway, I called it 24/7. Will it be hell or will it be heaven? You know, so it's yeah, that's, you know, it just kind of pops in there somehow. I don't know.
Well, I'm glad that you brought a poem that brings meter and rhyme into the picture, you know, because those are really that kind of music. It's important. It's one of the tools available to us. I know when I talked to my mom, you know, I thought I was supposed to do other things. So I really started writing seriously fairly later on after trying a couple of other things. And my mother was like, what happened to meter and rhyme? Like, wait a minute, that's what I thought it was. And it has been, right, as a memory tool for so long. And I'm glad that it's still part of still part of the landscape of poems. I'm glad that you had that poem with us today.
It's the only thing I know.
Kind of irresistible, really, when you're listening to a poem with rhyme and meter. The music part of us, I suppose.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about books. We've talked about what happens when we make a poem. Betsy, you want to jump into that at all?
I think I'm good. You guys are fantastic. This has been, like I said, I'm Shel Silverstein's my model. Although Shirley, when you mentioned Billy Collins, I did read some of his because we had the library or the Friends of the Library a long time ago when he was poet, well, not that long, but a while ago when he was a poet laureate, we brought him here and he spoke at the college. And that was fantastic.
Yeah, that's when I discovered him.
Yeah.
And then what he did when he was poet laureate for the schools with the poem each day. And, you know, without the little, you know, thing that you get with some poetry in the schools, you know, like tell us about the symbolism, tell us about this, tell us about that, you know, that it, if I can't get into a poem with the title or the first line, I don't read it.
Mm-hmm.
That's just it. And I think that poetry, that Billy Collins made poetry accessible to our young people in that way.
Yeah,
Some
that's a
of
good
his
description.
poems are just to live for. I can't tell you how many campus days that I've led or other when I've been asked to speak that I can't tell you how many times I've read the poem Forgetfulness, because to me, it just says it all. As you get older or you have a bad memory, like I've always had.
There's another Billy Collins poem that teachers use, I would say, a fair amount, and I can't remember the name of it. Maybe it's Poetry Workshop is the name of the poem, where he's describing a scene in which people have tied a poem to the chair and they're trying to beat, right? You know the poem. They're trying to beat the meaning out of it, right?
Yes,
and I think it perfectly explains the frustration. You know, if you're used to reading prose and narrative and story, you might be looking for a story. And I think it's a different kind of reading. Like, what is that moment? I think you talked about the moment.
Being in the moment, yeah.
Correctly, but it's a different kind of meal, you know, when you're reading a poem.
Yeah, I remember that poem too.
It does no good to thrash it. Do you want to say something about that, Elizabeth? You obviously know that poem.
I always used to open my creative writing classes at the college with that poem. And I'd say, we're not doing this. This is what we're not doing.
Yeah.
Well,
No,
this has been, go ahead.
Oh, do we have a time limit, Betsy?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
I was going to tell you, my dad grew up, he went to a one-room schoolhouse until the 8th grade, and near Owasso, and farm kid. And he was part of that tradition where every spring there was some kind of gathering where every child had to say a piece, right? They had to memorize a poem. And at the end of his life, he was trying to remember a particular poem. It was bothering him that he couldn't remember it. But I think about how that was incorporated into kind of a yearly ritual, that you would memorize a poem and then say it for others. And I wish we still did that.
Me too.
Did anybody have that experience when you were coming up?
In Grand Rapids, they had a book that you got when you started school, and it was called Memory Selections. And every semester you had to memorize certain poems, which are still in here. I think it was a fantastic thing to do, just great. And my grandmother grew up in that same kind of tradition, and she could recite the prologue to the Canterbury Tales until the day she died. I mean,
Wow.
it was fantastic what they taught them back then. It was great.
We have
Well,
a
I-
98-year-old here who can recite poems or verse after verse after verse, and songs, verse after verse after verse. It just amazes me.
Yeah. I never had to do that as a kid, but as a musician, that's pretty much what we do. Yeah.
Mhm.
I sometimes tell my students, I don't know how, I don't think you can climb up inside the Statue of Liberty anymore. Can you still do that? Are you still allowed
No.
to do that? But I did that once. I wouldn't call it a pleasant experience, but I'm glad I did it because it gave me a good metaphor for memorizing poems, because you're kind of inside and you're climbing around the poem. And I feel similarly about memorizing a piece of music, actually. Once you're inside it, you can kind of explore it in a different way. You understand it in a different way, how it's put together.
Well, it's kind of required that you, if you want to do well in a performance art, you need to know your artwork. I'm not going to say inside and out. What I want to say is 4 or 5 different ways. You know, do you know it this way? Do you know it that way? Do you, there are so many ways you can appreciate and know a piece of art, and you really need to know it at that level in so many different ways, so that it's there reliably when you're in the hot seat and you have to, reproduce it as a performance. And which, we can do that with poetry too. How many ways can we know and understand a poem, right? Yeah.
Well, and I've found it useful to have a few of my own poems memorized, because sometimes I've gone to a reading with a certain group of poems I thought I was going to read that were not appropriate at all for that group. So then I could, use my fallback memory.
That's a nice idea.
Betsy, have any of the audience written in questions?
No, they haven't. I think they're
We
just listening
must
to
be
our
so
discussion.
mesmerizing.
Yes. It's been great. This has been a great conversation, especially coming from someone who doesn't know poetry very well. It opens your eyes. So I'm glad we did this. Thank you everyone for coming tonight, and for Teresa for hosting this and leading the discussion. I'm not sure that it would have been as great had it been just me, because you asked some really insightful questions. I love that. You
Good.
brought it
Yeah,
along.
it was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
poets have to be humble, right? You have kind of a countercultural art. Maybe art is always countercultural, and yet it's cultural at the same time. Kind of a
Right.
conundrum. But we joke that if the audience outnumbers the poet, then it's been a successful reading. And we can be generous about claiming ourselves as audience as well, since everyone read a little bit.
Right.
So
This was fun. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Great.
thank you very much, all of you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Betsy, for hosting this.
That was fun.
It was fun.
I
Let's do it
appreciate
again.
it.
Sounds good.